So once again, we have taken a dip in a class-based Final Fantasy game. This is actually the most unrecognized of the SNES trilogy. That's because back in the game's prime, it was not internationalized. Japan only got it for a good while before the PlayStation had arrived and gave the rest of the world a taste of the 5th entry. But aside from that, the game has actually had some pretty positive reception, so that's pretty neat. So just like before, this game is being played on active with a speed of 1. If you don't know what that is, I suggest watching the Final Fantasy IV video, because from that video going forward, I won't be talking about it unless there's some kind of significant change worth mentioning. But just know that if you're playing it on a different mode or with a different speed, you might have different experiences. So following tradition, this game is being played on the Game Boy Advance. Although this version is a little modified because there's some frame rate issues with it, particularly with the final boss, and I didn't really want to put up with that just in case it had any kind of interference or take away from immersion, so I just applied the patch. Also came with a SNES music patch that I couldn't get around. I actually do like the GBA Final Fantasy V soundtrack, but there was nothing I could really do about it, and I'd rather have optimization over a petty little music choice. So with that, I've got to say, Final Fantasy V is pretty reminiscent of my experience with Final Fantasy I and III. Similar to Final Fantasy I, the world of Final Fantasy V is running into an elemental crisis. The king of the Tycoon Kingdom, a province known for holding the Wind Crystal, is going on a journey to see what exactly is going on with the wind as it has stopped blowing. In the meantime, his daughter, Lena, is to stay at the castle because it's too dangerous or whatever. Not too far from this castle, our main protagonist, Bart Klauser, an adventurer who doesn't really have any goal in life, is resting with his pet chocobo, named Boko. Although this rest is short-lived because not long after, a random meteorite comes crashing down. So Bart heads over to investigate and finds Lena being attacked by goblins. He finishes them off and then they introduce themselves. But they see that not far from them, there's an old man collapsed by the meteorite itself, like inches from the meteorite. He's held back on his feet, but unfortunately he can't recall anything other than the fact that his name is Galuf. Both of the men, deciding to join Lena on her quest to the Wind Shrine, end up encountering some pirates. The trio decides to steal one of the pirates' ships, but this doesn't really work out and they're caught by the pirate leader, Ferris. The three are asked to state their business, and then Lena comes up, flashes her pendant, and then idiotically reveals herself to be the Princess of Tycoon, which ends up getting them, unsurprisingly, captured. However, Ferris notices that she has the exact same pendant as Lena. So, the next day, she unties them and decides to join their party, with the ulterior motive to see if she can find anything about her origins. And this is where our adventure starts. Gotta be honest with you, Final Fantasy V's plot is honestly kinda stupid. I'm not necessarily talking about the writing itself, because it can actually be pretty unique at times, but the way the actual story itself progresses can be kinda stupid. If it tells you anything, the main antagonist of Final Fantasy V, known as X-Death, this guy almost always says "Mwahahaha" when he does something evil. But that isn't exactly to say that 5 doesn't have anything worth bringing to the table. Final Fantasy V looks about as good as I'd expect a GBA Final Fantasy game to look. That is to say, really good. A la Final Fantasy IV Advance, the overworld looks cleaner, and the battle scenes look a lot nicer. But unfortunately, Final Fantasy V for the Game Boy Advance did not get the same treatment for character sprites that Final Fantasy IV did. With Final Fantasy IV, characters got more depth in their sprites, they looked a lot more colorful, they had more pop to them. Final Fantasy V was left exactly the way it was, so transitioning from 4 to 5 can be kind of awkward. The portraits also look pretty awesome. The only ones I didn't really like were Bart's portrait and Lena's portrait. They're really devoid of color and it almost looks like they're lacking vitamin C. But other than little nitpicky details like that, FF5 looks really awesome. It's the Final Fantasy colorfulness we're used to. I'm not even really sure why I do this anymore. I'm sure you don't know why I'm doing this anymore, but we gotta follow through with tradition. FF5's soundtrack is awesome. It's generally pretty playful and cheesy at times. And I can't say that it necessarily tops Final Fantasy IV's soundtrack, because, you know, again, militant soundtracks are just my thing, but 5 is actually really good. And hey, I can't hold it against Nobuo Uematsu for wanting to try different types of soundtracks. The man is a man of experimentation, and we must respect that. I mean, also, this game has the absolute godsend of a song that is The Clash on the Big Bridge. I know that is not in any way an original opinion, but that song is really, really good. So, once again, as stated at the beginning of the video, this is a class-based game like Final Fantasy 1 and 3. But it's got a little bit of a twist. The ability to inherit one skill from one class while playing with another. This is addicting. As you guys can see from the early footage of the gameplay, I have planned to go with my usual format. Black Mage, White Mage, a Knight, and some miscellaneous class. That was a little short-lived, because something happened. I got curious. You ever wanted your Black Mage to run around wielding a katana? You ever wanted your White Mage to toss their staff aside, put up their dukes, and beat up the final boss with their bare hands? You ever wanted a thief to call upon Leviathan when things get kinda rough? Or maybe you like to see your restless knight domesticate animals. Final Fantasy V is full of weird stuff like this, and it's awesome. It's because of this feature that, as of this video, Final Fantasy V is the Final Fantasy game I've grinded the most in. Yeah, I know. Robert's going through a whole grinding character arc thing. Whatever. You guys are probably wondering why I mentioned grinding. In order to transfer skills, you need to obtain ability points, or ABP as we'll call them, which you obtain from both random encounters and boss battles. After you collect enough ABP, your class will level up. Most classes usually let you learn their most basic skill at class level 1 and offer more as you level up that class. For example, if a character masters the Dragoon class, they'll be able to use the abilities Jump or Equip Lances outside of that class. The motive behind nearly all the grinding that I've done in Final Fantasy V was because I had an idea, and I wanted to grind out so that I could see how this weird class combination will play out. And of course, if you don't give a crap about this system, you really don't have to do it at all. You can just play it like you would Final Fantasy 1 or Final Fantasy 3, and that's the beauty of it. There is a bit of a gatekeeping-ish problem with grinding out to see combinations play out, and that's the fact that you'll probably be losing a lot of gil, because you'll have to get gear to accommodate for these class switches. And if you're constantly experimenting with it, you're pretty much going to be like a college student, so be careful. FF5 also has the return of stat proficiency, although that's really not new, but still, it has returned. And it's based on what class a character is and how long they spend with that class. This helps keep somewhat more advanced classes from being go-to solutions for when something gets a little too difficult. For instance, if Bartz has been a Black Mage since the start of the game and Galuf, who's been a Knight up until halfway through, is switched over to a Black Mage as well, he's not going to be as good at using black magic as Bartz is at that point in the game, at least not for a while. This is a really good restriction, because it encourages the player to be committed to a class or a character, making the choice of class switching carry more weight. Although, something I personally really don't like about Final Fantasy V is how obnoxious it can be with weapon restrictions. For example, there's a new type of sword called the Knight Sword, which can only be used by knights. And breaking the game up like this was kinda to be expected, but at the same time, knowing that weapons like the Defender, one of my favorite swords in the Final Fantasy series so far because it's just good about dealing good damage and keeping the person using the Defender safe because of the higher damage, or in the case of this game, the Defender can straight up block attacks, which is awesome. But you know, the iconic Defender, I love that weapon, and the Dragoon could use that in Final Fantasy IV, can't use it anymore in Final Fantasy V, without using the ability Equip Sword, so you kinda have to streamline the class a little bit. I don't care for that too much. I get that this sort of had to be done because Square didn't want classes sort of overlapping in FF5, but I simply don't like this format. That being said, I'm not really gonna hold it against the developers or the game because this change kind of had to happen. I just simply don't care for it. In other news, although I am pretty sure that this is something that comes with the GBA version of Final Fantasy V, we have menu shortcuts, which really just waters menu searching down from like 2 to 5 button inputs to just 2 inputs. This isn't necessarily something that'll sell me on the game. Like if it disappeared forever, I really wouldn't care. But if you found the previous Final Fantasy menus frustrating, then I'm pretty sure you will like this. Now, getting back to issues. Something that I didn't really care for too much with Final Fantasy V is that it's too easy. I know that Final Fantasy isn't particularly known for its difficulty, because I've played far more crushing games. But Final Fantasy V is nearly as easy as the original game, and that's going a little overboard if you ask me. Regarding the ATB format, Enemies in Final Fantasy IV were generally pretty fast. In fact, usually they would attack the moment the battle started. But their swift actions in battle is what made them very enjoyable to fight, because if you fooled around for long enough, you would get beaten to death. It's not like Final Fantasy V's enemies are sitting around with their thumbs up their butt, but they remember. Yeah, I see you over there. Yeah, you, right there. You've made fun of me for every video now, and I'm getting kind of tired of it. Yeah, now you want to creep down because I'm calling you out. Yeah, get out of here. Scat. Skabobble, go away. Oh jeez! But they wait a remarkably longer time to do anything than before. And usually they don't hit all that hard at that, so it's kind of underwhelming at times. Adding to the injury is the fact that shields in this game now have a chance of completely nullifying any physical damage. So not only do you get extra defense, but you have a chance to just take no damage at all. Doesn't really help that skill execution in this game is also pretty fast. Most skills pretty much execute the moment you call them, so there is little weight to decision making. In fact, they activate so quick that you don't even have time to go into the next character, so you have to wait for that previous character to carry out their action, and then you can move on to the next one, making battles feel a little sluggish at times. Speaking of sluggish, FF5's battles have a very start and stop pace to them sometimes. Occasionally, while the game is planning out its logic, it will stop for a moment before continuing. Now, Final Fantasy IV had the exact same issue. The thing is, Final Fantasy IV was a lot faster to recover from this problem. Final Fantasy V is slower. What makes this issue especially frustrating is the fact that the ATB gauges in this game are a lot less precise. So when two characters have ATB gauges filled to a similar point, and the game then stops, it can be kind of difficult to understand who's going to be up next. Adding a little bit more guesswork into it, I don't care for that. I hate to make so many comparisons like this because it makes it sound like, well, why isn't it in this game? You know, because that's obnoxious. But the thing about 5 is that it has issues that range from being subjective, which is fine, to just being objectively worse in functionality, and that needs to be addressed. FF5's level design has 3 moods. Classic Final Fantasy dungeons that we all know and love, obnoxious trial and error based dungeons, and downright confusing dungeons. The first, the classic Final Fantasy dungeon, speaks for itself. The trial and error ones really just involve knowing, you know, alright, that didn't work, well let's try this. I don't really care for those, but it's not like it really ruins my day. I can play through and I can still have a good time. The ones I really don't like are the really confusing ones that just get on my nerves a lot. There are a few dungeons in 5 that have layouts or aesthetics that make them difficult to navigate. They all look same-ish. So trying to identify the right way to go can be a little hard at times. There's a couple times you may or may not see in this footage where I'm just kind of going in a circle. That's because I'm trying to find where to go next. I've never had to look up a guide because of this problem, but I could just really live without it. One thing I really do like a lot about FF5's level design was that it's a little more creative. It isn't so much like how it was in the last 4 games, which just kind of go here, go there, find boss, kill boss. FF5 has some interesting stuff like library puzzles, ventilation puzzles, and even using elevators. It's kind of cool, actually. I won't say that the secrets in this game aren't as prevalent because I truly do not know that, but I didn't engage with secrets as much in Final Fantasy V. Secrets in this game were more streamlined into the Thief class. Only the Thief can see secret passages, so visual cues and wit-based secrets really aren't a thing in this game. I didn't really bother with the Thief class because the Thief makes you run so ridiculously fast, and I can't handle that. So I'll take the L here and say that my lack of enjoyment with the secrets was mostly a me problem, because I chose to make them nearly impossible to detect, but I will say that I very much prefer the aforementioned visual and wit-based secrets. They were simply far more appealing to me, and even then, the Thief class is just basically a win button, so that's just not as appealing to me. FF5 is a strange ride. So let's start with the game's flagship feature, skill combining. Not once throughout this entire game did I get tired of this feature. From beginning to end, I had a crazy amount of fun making these abominations that are hardly even considered classes anymore. And the fact that you get more ABP as you progress through the game just makes the skill combining more addicting because it becomes easier to do. But there is one major issue with skill combining. You can utterly break the game with it. Some of these potential combinations clearly were not thought through. Now, FF5 being a generally easy game doesn't mean that it never tries to be difficult. But the further you get into this game, you get put up against more challenges, but because you can break the game so easily, you can pretty much negate any challenge throughout the experience. Let's go through some examples. The Knight has an ability called Two-Handed, which allows you to deal double damage at the cost of not being able to use a shield. It's a matter of choosing offense over defense, and it can make a difference depending on what you're going through at the moment. However, there is a skill that is a borderline straight upgrade from another class, the Monk's ability to use Focus. Focus allows you to deal double damage, but you have to wait a short amount of time before it is executed. Basically, it's pretty much just like Yang's power ability from FF4. By temporarily training your Knight as a monk until they get Focus, you can switch over back and you get the same damage as Two-Handed, but now you can have a shield while doing it. It just takes a little longer to pull off. And yes, while the Knight is charging up their sword to deal that double damage, they can still block. So your techie Knight just gets tankier. Here's some more broken sets. A Black Mage that excels in barehanded can make them almost too deadly of a class, because they have immense strength and immense magic ability. A Dragoon with either barehanded or dual wield, because if you use jump, you get to deal 2 jump attacks at the cost of 1 usage. A Berserker with two-handed. A Berserker is a class that's really strong, but you can't control them. And a Berserker with two-handed is just too strong. They destroy pretty much everything in their path. If you put haste on them, they can clear a battle in seconds. It's ridiculous. For me personally, the most game-breaking combination had to be a dual-wielding Mystic Knight that can use Flare. The Mystic Knight has an ability called Spellblade, which allows them to enchant a weapon with black magic. If you teach a Mystic Knight to use dual wield, you can enchant both weapons at one time. So if you find yourself some good swords for the Mystic Knight to use, you can become effortlessly overpowered once you combine them with Flare. Double Flare Mystic Knight, or DFMK as we'll call it, is so overpowered that 2 successful hits usually outperforms Bahamut in damage, with only a single spending of 30 magic points, versus Bahamut's 66 MP. Even with the Golden Hairpin, which halves MP usage, that's only 33 MP for Bahamut. The only real downside to DFMK is the fact that you can only get it in the last quarter of the game. But let's pull it back a little bit for a second. Let's talk about FF5's boss difficulty and how it fluctuates in a very strange way. So for the first quarter of Final Fantasy V, the game is all around pretty effortless. Beyond that point, it gets weird. While the enemies are generally a cakewalk, there's a good chunk of bosses in Final Fantasy V that are just plain annoying. FF5's got a knack for spamming supernova bosses and bosses that just have a plain obnoxious gimmick about them. More often than not, these bosses are abnormally good at whatever their forte is. Whether it be a supernova attack that they like to use a whole lot and it kills their party really fast, or it's just some really obnoxiously weird gimmick like on every third turn if you attack me I get like 2000 HP back. It's always something really dumb like that when it comes to gimmicks. It gets even worse if you don't have a full party for whatever the reason. The Antlion fight in particular is just terrible because you have very little manpower and the boss just keeps lowering your level so you're dealing less and less damage. That fight is a slog. And it's not like FF5 is really forcing you to do anything in these boss fights, but it's really disappointing that the game is echoing issues that Final Fantasy III had. But despite a lot of this frustration, there is a spell and a class that can pretty much break all of this: Haste and the Dragoon. Haste increases your speed, so if you spam it enough times, you have party members that move really fast and the boss have a hard time keeping up with them. And the Dragoon trick really only works if you spam it in numbers. Have 2 or more people play as the Dragoon and just have them constantly jump, and the boss is really limited on what they can do. And usually it even seems like the boss's AI gets a little confused and they start like just doing physical attacks, not even doing their supernovas because it's not really gonna hit anybody. And then when you lump these 2 tactics in with the DFMK that we mentioned just a little earlier, really using any of these tactics separately can get you through a hard time, and that's kind of ridiculous. So while Final Fantasy V can be hard at times, even the difficult moments can be cheesed for the most part. And this is just what I came up with. I'm sure that you, the viewer, can also find your own way to break the game. One more gameplay complaint before we move on to the story. So this was a straight nitpick, but I don't like the third overworld. So in the story, it's revealed that Bartz and Gelef are from 2 totally different worlds. Later on, run into X-Death, X-Death's crystals get destroyed, the 2 worlds merge into one. This third overworld is confusing, because it takes what you knew about the first two overworlds and kinda moves them around a little bit, and puts them into one. The map can only help me so much, because I will be going one way, thinking that I'm heading to where I want to go, and then realize, oh wait, this is not where I want it to be, so then I end up going back to try to find where I was trying to go to. It's really awkward, and I don't care for this third overworld at all. It really would have helped if the game started off with this overworld. I would have rather just one overworld as opposed to taking what you know and then just move it around so it just keeps fooling you. That's annoying. Also, one more thing, because I'm sure some people are a little confused. You might have noticed that Galuf gets replaced by a little girl every once in a while in the footage. That's because at a certain point of the story, Galuf ends up getting killed by Exdeath, and Kryl, his granddaughter, takes his place. She ends up taking all of his stats and whatnot. She's just a replacement for him. They're the exact same character by a gameplay standpoint. As for the story, I've already described the story as stupid, and to the end, it remains stupid. And I even say that the events that play out in Final Fantasy V are very forgettable. I know, I have terrible memory, but Final Fantasy V had me checking out sometimes. It just really isn't that interesting to me. It was just so cheesy and just kinda so goofy at times that I'm just kinda like, alright, that's enough. With that being said, the character interactions themselves in Final Fantasy V, fantastic. The game is often pretty funny. Bartz is more often than not the comedy relief. As he was a person raised to explore the world, he is not very educated and lacks manners. And from goofy stuff like accidentally discovering that Faris is a woman, to trying to knock out a 14-year-old girl, it's something else. But my favorite aspect about Final Fantasy V's characterization is the fact that the game often feels like a living and breathing world. For instance, there's several pubs in this game that have dancers in them, and you can watch the dance performance just for fun. But there is a pub in Galuf's world that lacks a dancer. You can actually go up on the stage and dance up there, and you will get paid for it. There's a piano stat that you can upgrade throughout the game. The more pianos you discover, the more your piano skills level up, causing you to get better. Cool thing about this too is that you can obtain a song for your bard class called the Hero's Rhyme, which is a legendary spell. There's several flashbacks that you can unlock throughout the game, such as King Tycoon trying to teach Faris to ride a windrake, or even more extreme ones like Bart's seeing his mother die from her own illness. There's this cool little attention to detail where King Zizat's army is attacked by Exdeath's monsters, and after the battle, a lot of soldiers are injured, and thus, the inn within Zizat's castle is booked up completely, and you can't use it. But my personal favorite moment of characterization has to be a scene in the town of Regal where Galuf sneaks off into the night. Bartz notices that Galuf isn't sleeping in his respective bed and investigates. In most RPGs, usually this is some kind of sneaky ulterior motive, maybe bad guy-ish character arc. It's really nothing like that. Turns out Galuf just wanted to try out the town's signature brew. Bartz realizes that there's really nothing more to the situation, so he takes a seat and talks to Galuf about how far they've come. From situations such as Bartz and the other two coming to Galuf's world even though Galuf told him not to stuff like Galuf's effort to try to thwart Exdeath. The thing about this scene is that it's pointless, you don't need to see it at all. But it really helps add to the fact that the people in FF5 feel like exactly that. People. I don't think anything is ever going to top Earthbound for my personal favorite world in a video game, but Final Fantasy V hits similar beats to it, which is great. The only problem about this kind of characterization is that a lot of it starts to disappear in the last quarter of Final Fantasy V. In fact, the last quarter of the game is honestly the weakest part of the entire experience. So, as it turns out, Exdeath's plan is to harness the power of the Void, an ancient power beyond time and space. The Void is kind of an embodiment of nothing, a vacuum that sucks everything in. It's just kind of like ultimate nothingness, or like divide by zero, I guess. They don't really explain it too well. Exdeath's ambition doesn't really stretch all that far. He just wants the Void because he just kind of wants to become the strongest thing in the universe. That's really all he wants. If you're wondering why Exdeath is such a basic villain, it's because he was actually a tree that was transformed into a warlock after a bunch of evil monsters were sealed inside of said tree. I'm not joking. But anyway, during this time, you're instructed by a turtle sage called Guido that you have to search for 4 tablets, which will get you 3 out of the 12 legendary weapons that you can use to slay Exdeath. After you get the first tablet, Exdeath decides that he wants to flex a little bit and uses the Void to consume certain parts of the world, including Bartz's hometown. At this point, the game has pretty much become an open world experience. You can get the tablets in any order you want, you can go fight some bonus bosses, get some bonus gear, it's up to you. You can even skip the remaining tablets and just go straight to the final dungeon if you wanted to. Now personally, I think you're cheating yourself out of an experience a little bit, but it's up to you. I guess that's kinda neat. But I would encourage getting as much content as you possibly can before going into the final dungeon. If for no other reason than to just simply smooth out yourself so that you'll be looking pretty good once you get to it, so you aren't getting crushed by any really hard bosses or anything. The tablet dungeons are a little harder than average, but they end up still falling prey to the game's easy nature. None of the bosses were really hard either. The only one that really gave me trouble was the Wendigo, because I didn't know what its gimmick was, so I just kept attacking until it died, and well, that worked, so cool I guess. But you know the drill. Bahamut, Leviathan, and Odin, check. Infinity plus 1 sword, check. Maxing out all the important items, check. Making a composition that cripples everything in your path, check. Abusing save points, check. Let's go kill ourselves a tree. Similar to Final Fantasy III, nearly all the challenge is just kind of destroyed. For pretty much the entire dungeon, I just kind of spammed Odin's Zentetskin, and it pretty much worked. For those that don't know, Odin's Zentetskin can one-shot nearly all enemies. What made this especially easy is the fact that I gave Lena, my summoner, a golden hairpin, so the magic required to summon Odin was halved, simply making it more spammable. For any of the bosses that actually gave me trouble in this dungeon, I just learned what it did and adapted my DFMK around it, and that worked. Even the final stretch of the dungeon was not that hard. Odin could even Zentetskin behemoths, and those guys are notoriously strong enemies in the Final Fantasy series. Once you reach X-Death, unfortunately, he's managed to master the power of the Void at this point. So after zapping a bunch of places into the Void, he ends up zapping the 4 Heroes of Light into the Void, before Galuf, along with his fellow Warriors of Dawn, kinda zap them back and block off X-Death's ability to use the Void. So X-Death realizes that nothing else can be done here other than to fight the Warriors of Light themselves. Hey, lean in real close, I got something to tell you. This boss fight sucks! If you play this battle on a high speed, X-Death moves way too fast, and more often than not, he casts his strongest spells just over and over again, making avoiding death almost impossible. In this first phase of the boss battle, X-Death particularly likes to spam White Hole, which not only kills your party member instantly, but it also petrifies them, making reviving them a 2-step process that is irritating. So then I put the battle on a slower speed, and then X-Death proceeded to do next to nothing. Now I know, I put it on a slower battle speed, so X-Death is going to move slower. The weird thing about this is the fact that X-Death doesn't even seem to rely on his primary spells that much anymore, he just kinda starts doing physicals. So this leads me to believe that X-Death either has weird priorities, or the boss fight is just bugged. And trust me, I tried everything in my power to avoid putting this battle on a lower speed, because I love battle speed of 1, but I simply could not beat this guy. So really, no matter what I chose to put this boss battle speed on, I was not having fun with it. Anyway, getting back to plot stuff, you give X-Death the beatdown for a little bit, and his plan backfires really badly, and he gets sucked into the Void. However, as X-Death is being reverted to nothingness, he becomes corrupted and comes to a new conclusion that as he reverts to nothingness, so should the rest of the universe. Yeah, it doesn't really make any sense, but since he's being engulfed by something that doesn't make sense, I guess that makes sense. So, what comes of this? An abomination known as Neo X-Death. So I'm gonna be really real with you right here. Low speed Neo X-Death is about as threatening as a high school freshman. But since this is RoberOnocle, we might as well go over the specifics. Neo X-Death's ability, Almagest. Pretty much a carbon copy of Zeromus' Big Bang ability. Nobody likes it, and it forces your white mage to keep casting Kiraga, lest your entire party die. But regardless of what speed you're on, Neo X-Death's ability, Grand Cross, kind of annoying no matter what. This ability does one thing, it applies one random effect to each of your party members. This ranges from minor inconveniences like being silenced or blinded, to more devastating effects like petrification or even death. Now there is actually a chance that nothing will happen to you, but it is kinda low. And that's really it for exclusive abilities. Neo X-Death has other moves like Maelstrom or Thundaga, but you guys already know what those are. Now I had brought some Dragoons just in case things got hairy because this was actually the first time I tried fighting the boss on a low speed, but I didn't even really need them. To be honest, fighting this boss under these speed conditions makes it really no harder than fighting the Cloud of Darkness with the proper gear. The fight's just longer. So after being mostly stared at by Neo X Death for roughly 11 minutes and 22 seconds, the battle was settled. Following tradition from other class-based Final Fantasies, Final Fantasy V gives us an exposition dump post-final battle. So in the beginning, there was only the Void, and from this Void was born 4 crystals: Earth, Fire, Water, and Wind. These 4 crystals gave life to the world of Final Fantasy, and humanity, being derived from and devoted to these essences, will carry the light needed to protect this world from the Void itself. Specifically, the 4 Warriors of Light, each acting as a spiritual manifestation of an element, will deliver this world from nothingness. In a nutshell, the world of Final Fantasy cannot cease to exist. Afterwards, the very scenario described by the exposition happens. Bartz and co. wake up within the Void, and the shards from the shattered crystals that they had gathered each restore themselves to their proper places. This, in turn, undoes what the Void has taken from the united world. With the aid of the Warriors of Dawn, the party has a means to escape the Void via Windrake and return to the restored world. However, as everyone else prepares to leave the Void, Bartz, due to injuries from the battle, no longer possesses the energy to move on from the Void, and quickly drifts away from the rest of the party as they move in the opposite direction. Sometime after, Mid, Cid's grandson, receives a letter from Lena, describing their experiences since the fall of X-Death. Everyone has returned to their normal lives, although with slight uncertainty. Lena and Ferris, who had been revealed to be long-lost sisters, returned to Castle Tycoon to rule over the kingdom in the late King Tycoon's stead. Although Ferris is more concerned about her pirate crew than being a princess, so the latter is pretty much out of the question. Unfortunately, with Galuf, the king of Baal, dead, there is no one to take his place, although the likely candidate is Cryle once she becomes of age. Bartz's pet chocobo, Boko, having found a partner named Coco, has now become a father of 3. However, he's saddened that Bartz is not here to see his kids. Unfortunately, with no trace of Bartz in sight, he is presumed to have passed away. Lena decides to arrange plans to pay tribute to all of those who died for the cause. This is the Bartz is dead ending. As it turns out, Final Fantasy V has alternate endings, with the simple condition being who is conscious at the end of the fight with Neo X Death. Final Fantasy V has 15 endings, and that may seem impressive, but the true ending is hardly different from the other 14. In this ending, everything is exactly the same except Cryle is writing the letter, and Bartz shows up in certain scenes now, as well as him visiting his parents' grave. In the final scene of the true ending, Cryle drops a bouquet and mourns the death of her grandfather, Galuf, talking about how she feels alone now. Bartz, hiding in the trees with Lena and Ferris, reassures Cryle that she's not alone and that she has made new friends. Afterwards, the Warriors of Light each hears a calling of nature pertaining to their own respective element, before setting off for another adventure. In the Bartz is dead ending, Lena drops the bouquet, mourning the loss of Bartz and wishing he was still here. Afterwards, Galuf's ghostly voice chimes in to tell the remaining warriors that it's not your time yet, before Bartz straight up descends from heaven. I'm not even joking. Before having the context of the alternate endings, I was completely confused by this Bartz is dead ending. It seemed that it happened the way it did just because. I mean, think about it, it's your first time playing Final Fantasy V. You beat the final boss, Bartz is like, I'm sleepy, and just kinda drifts away, and then everybody's like, I wonder where Bartz is at, and then Galuf just says, hey, it's not your time yet, and Bartz just comes back, and they're just like, hey, do you hear that call of nature? And they just leave. Like, that's just too abrupt for me, man. I had to go on the internet and look this up. I know that I spent the vast majority of this video talking about the various problems of Final Fantasy V, and yes, they do retract from the overall quality of the game. I'll leave it to you to determine whether or not I rightfully compared this game to Final Fantasy IV, but in my eyes, Final Fantasy V simply lacks polish in where Final Fantasy IV just did it better. Going from one game to another, FF5 feels rushed. The battle gauge shouldn't be this spotty. The game is often poorly balanced, being either too easy or too hard. The general flow of battles could be a bit difficult to work with, and the game especially loses a lot of steam near the end, save for the usual fun endgame collecting stuff. But you know what? Despite these glaring issues, I still generally had a really good time with this game. Even if the balancing is just jacked up, it isn't like I'm not used to an overly forgiving Final Fantasy, and for each really annoying challenge, they're easy enough to get around. Experimentation is this game's primary forte, and it'd be foolish to call this game bad or even average when I'm so addicted and eager to see how I can break the game or approach the more difficult encounters like properly balanced foes or the godforsaken Tonberry. I guess if I were to judge purely by the quality that I've come to expect from Final Fantasy at this point, it's easy enough to say that this is a disappointing entry in the series. But that's okay. Final Fantasy V may be a one-trick pony, but that isn't to say it didn't choose a trick that would last.